I talk a lot about giving dogs choices and meeting their needs, but that doesn't mean that I think they should run amok at other people's expense. In fact, I strongly believe that you should have control of your dog out in public, and it's one of the few things that I believe for all dogs, no matter what. We have a responsibility to prevent our dogs from forcing others to interact with them. If I see someone out walking or hiking or biking with or without other dogs, my dog shouldn't go up to them unless I've given permission, even if my dog is off leash. And if I can't prevent that from happening, that's my bad. My dog needs to go back on leash. It is absolutely possible to strike a balance between letting your dog be a dog and not interfering with other people's rights to be in the outdoors without your dog's involvement. So how do I personally get there? Let's take a deep dive into my approach with Longlines. I use Longlines to build dogs' reliability off-leash. Yep, I leash dogs to teach them how to behave off-leash. How much it's needed depends on several factors, including the dog's history, age, and the results we're seeing. Specific to pups and young dogs, I really like an old gamekeeper saying I first heard from British trainer Kay Lawrence. Up to 12 months on lead, a lifetime off lead. But off lead before 12 months, a lifetime on lead. We need to build a strong learning history, and adolescents are going to go through developmental stages during which it will be perfectly natural for them to take off and ignore you, even if they were doing well as babies. So I want to work through these stages proactively to save me a lot of work and headache later on. As a general rule for all dogs, I want to use the long line until the dog shows me I can trust him or her off leash consistently under all conditions. Until then, I can use the long line to give the dog varying degrees of freedom and use it to safely test the dog under challenging conditions. It's no good to use it when there are no distractions around, decide I don't need it anymore, and then put my dog in situations where he can't resist temptation. Those situations are when I need it the most to safely teach the dog what I want him to do when, for example, a deer runs in front of him. I'll be reinforcing the desired behavior in real-life scenarios, but the long line prevents the dog from self-rewarding if he or she just can't resist. Getting to chase fast-moving objects or interact with people or dogs without permission makes a real dent in training, and this one simple piece of equipment goes a long way in preventing that. It also makes refresher training a lot simpler if your dog has regressed a bit. The first time I used a long line with a puppy, it was kind of a disaster. Someone suggested it to me as an easy fix to give my dog more freedom at the beach, but instead of holding an overexcited puppy back with a 6-foot leash, I just ended up holding an overexcited puppy back on a 20-foot leash. The long line was a good idea, but I was coming from a traditional training approach and trying to embrace a more rewards-based approach without a solid understanding of how to do that. I knew I didn't want to correct him, but I didn't know what to do instead. So I ended up putting him in an overwhelming situation where at his level of training, he didn't want any of my food or toy rewards. The rewards he wanted were all out in the environment, the same things that I considered to be distractions. No matter how long the line was, I was holding him back from all of the things he wanted. I was the obstacle to those rewards. In the years that followed, I learned how to use the long line to my advantage, and I trained dogs at all different life stages successfully with it. But like many things, it's easiest when you start with a puppy. Here's some video of baby Relic. He started wearing a harness and long line in my yard the day he arrived, even though babies will typically stay close, and I could have outrun him if I needed to. I strongly advise starting this way before you need to, whenever possible. The puppy gets used to dragging the long line. It's there the first time you do need it, and it allows you to enforce boundaries neutrally. The long line allowed me to come off as the giver of all good things, rather than the obstacle to good things. Rather than calling him away from something incredible or telling him no or chasing him down if he ventured too far while exploring, I would simply step on the line. He'd get to the end and wouldn't be able to go any further, and he would find somewhere else to explore within my desired boundary. A lot of times he'd get bored and come find me. When he did that, I'd always make it a good time, whether I'd praise him before sending him off to explore again, or I would engage in play or another fun activity. I did a lot of moving away from him in the yard to foster a habit of keeping an eye on me and coming back to me. The long line safely allowed this to be his idea, his choice, building value and sticking with me. It also allowed me to give him valuable controlled exposure to a variety of distractions. I don't let my dogs out in my yard unsupervised, but I still want them to play and hang out with me in the yard when interesting things are going by, so I'm building that habit in the face of distractions with a long line. Practicing on the long line in the yard builds skills that you can more easily transfer to other locations. Off-property, in appropriate areas, Relic could walk on a 20 to 30 foot long line attached to his harness. I'm holding the line, but I'm letting it out and in to maintain slack. My objective here is to keep the long line loose for an off-leash feel and get the dog into the habit of sticking with me even if he's 25 feet away exploring in the woods. This is a great way to practice recalls safely.
Relic, come.
We can build on them with greater distractions later on. If he does venture in between the trees, he's close enough that I can drop the line and pick it up when he's come out on the other side.
Good boy.
I'll only drop the line in safe places under the right conditions, and he's had a strong history of sticking with me going back to day one, so I have a little wiggle room. If this was a dog with some experience running off, I might not drop the line at all at this stage. Having control of the long line lets me identify weaknesses in the current state of our training. For example, at 6 months old, Relic ignored his recall in favor of focusing on and wanting to go after a mountain bike that went by. The long line prevented this from happening and revealed a weakness we needed to work on: fast bicycles. Here's 10-month-old Relic. I'm not as formal about the long line as I am about loose leash walking, but I do want to teach dogs to yield to leash tension ahead of time. So Relic knows, based on his training history, that if something is attached to the back clip of his harness, he can pull a little bit. I want him to be comfortable pulling the long line loose from a root or some rocks. But I want him to also be mindful of who's on the other end of the line. So I don't want him pulling like a sled dog. That would cancel out the benefit of using a long line. Look at this. If he were to go to the end of the line, I will slow down, and based on his training history, he knows that he needs to put some slack in the line before we continue to move ahead. If he tries to continue to plow forward, I'm going to stop and call him back, and there needs to be slack in the line before we move on. When you're consistent about this, this part gets translated pretty easily to the dog. For long line management skills, I use a rough version of Grisha Stewart's BAT leash skills, B-A-T, and I encourage you to look into that if you're not already familiar with it. As Relic got more experience, I'd let him drag the line in safe areas. Sometimes I'd throw in an unexpected direction change, recall, or play session, so I wasn't being predictable, and unless there was an absolute emergency, I wasn't going to use his long line to control him. Remember, we're using it for management so we can strengthen the dog's off-leash skills at their level. Every time you use the line to get what you want, you're pointing out, hey, I can't control you without this line. This last bit of video was of Relic completely off-leash in a safe area. The habits we built are evident, and Relic sticks with me as a default. Now that you've seen me use the long line in real-life scenarios, I want to go over some key points for safety. So I always attach the line to the back of a harness. In the early videos, you saw Relic in a pet-safe 3-in-1 harness, and since then he's been wearing Blue 9 balance harnesses. You may have noticed something on his collar. That's a GPS tracker. because I like to plan for worst case scenarios. Thankfully, I've never needed to use it. Use common sense with the long line. Don't use it in populated areas or let it go long and let them wrap up people and other animals with it. If you need to get control of a moving long line, step on it. The friction caused by moving long line can take the skin right off your hands. Now, long lines are made in different materials. This one is biothane, which is a lot easier on the skin, but you can't put knots in it because it might break. So knots in a long line definitely make it a lot easier to step on effectively when it's moving, and different materials have different pros and cons. And what about dogs with a strong history of running off, or a strong prey drive, or a really strict leash law? There's nothing wrong with continuing to take your dog on a walk on the long line. It doesn't always have to be a stepping stone to off leash. As long as you have some decent leash handling skills and good spatial awareness, you and your dog can have some really enjoyable walks together like that. Whatever your end goal is, I hope I've given you a good idea of how to use a long line and some tips to use moving forward. Happy training!